Chapter 20, Part 2 of the Life of Harriet Beecher Stowe, compiled from her letters and journals by her son Charles Edward Stowe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 20, George Eliot, Part 2. During the summer of 1874, while Mrs. Stowe's brother, the Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, was the victim of a most revolting, malicious, and groundless attack on his purity, Mrs. Lewes wrote the following words of sympathy. My dear friend, the other day I had a letter from Mrs. Fields, written to let me know something of you under that heavy trouble, of which such information as I have had has been quite untrustworthy, leaving me in entire incredulity in regard to it, except on this point, that you and yours must be suffering deeply. Naturally, I thought most of you in the matter, the public aspects being indeterminate, and many times before our friend's letter came, I had said to Mr. Lewes, what must Mrs. Stowe be feeling? I remember Mrs. Fields once told me of the wonderful courage and cheerfulness which belonged to you, enabling you to bear up under exceptional trials, and I imagined you helping the sufferers with tenderness and counsel, but yet, nevertheless, I felt that there must be a bruising weight on your heart. Dear honored friend, you who are so ready to give warm fellowship, is it any comfort to you to be told that those afar off are caring for you in spirit, and will be happier for all good issues that may bring you rest? I cannot, dare not, write more in my ignorance, lest I should be using unreasonable words. But I trust in your not despising this scrap of paper, which tells you, perhaps rather for my relief than yours, that I am always in grateful sweet remembrance of your goodness to me and your energetic labors for all. End quote. It was 2 years or more before Mrs. Stowe replied to these words of sympathy. Orange Blossom Time, Mandarin, March 18th, 1876. My dear friend, I always think of you when the orange trees are in blossom. Just now they are fuller than ever, and so many bees are filling the branches that the air is full of a sort of still murmur. And now I am beginning to hear from you every month in Harper's. It is as good as a letter. Daniel Deronda has succeeded in awaking in my somewhat worn-out mind an interest. So many stories are tramping over one's mind in every modern magazine nowadays that one is macadamized, so to speak. It takes something unusual to make a sensation. This does excite and interest me, as I wait for each number with eagerness. I wish I could endow you with our long winter weather, not winter, except such as you find in Sicily. We live here from November to June, and my husband sits out on the veranda and reads all day. We emigrate in solid family. My 2 dear daughters, husband, self, and servants come together to spend the winter here, and so together to our northern home in summer. My twin daughters relieve me from all domestic care. They are lively, vivacious, with a real genius for practical life. We have around us a little settlement of neighbors who, like ourselves, have a winter home here, and live an easy, undressed, picnic kind of life, far from the world and its cares. Mr. Stowe has been busy on 8 volumes of Gorez on the mysticism of the Middle Ages. This Gorez was professor of philosophy at Munich, and he reviews the whole ground of the shadowland between the natural and the supernatural, ecstasy, trance, prophecy, miracles, spiritualism, and stigmata, etc. He was a devout Roman Catholic, and the so-called facts that he reasons on seem to me quite amazing. And yet the possibilities that lie between inert matter and man's living, all-powerful, immortal soul may make almost anything credible. The soul at times can do anything with matter. I have been busying myself with Saint Beuve's 7 volumes on the Port Royal development. I like him, Saint Beuve. His capacity of seeing, doing justice to all kinds of natures and sentiments, is wonderful. I am sorry he is no longer our side the veil. There is a red bird, Cardinal Grosbeak, singing in the orange trees fronting my window, so sweetly and insistently as to almost stop my writing. I hope, dear friend, you are well, better than when you wrote last. It was very sweet and kind of you to write what you did last. I suppose it is so long ago you may have forgotten, but it was a word of tenderness and sympathy about my brother's trial. It was womanly, tender, and sweet, such as at heart you are. After all, my love of you is greater than my admiration, for I think it more and better to be really a woman worth loving than to have read Greek and German and written books. And in this last book I read, I feel more with you in some little fine points. They stare at me as making an amusing exhibition. For, my dear, I feel myself at last as one who has been playing and picnicking on the shores of life, and waked from a dream late in the afternoon to find that everybody almost has gone over to the beyond, and the rest are sorting their things and packing their trunks, and waiting for the boat to come and take them. It seems now but a little time since my brother Henry and I were two young people together. He was my 2 years junior, and nearest companion out of 7 brothers and 3 sisters. I taught him drawing, and heard his Latin lessons, for you know a girl becomes mature and womanly long before a boy. I saw him through college, and helped him through the difficult love affair that gave him his wife, and then he and my husband had a real German enthusiastic love for each other, which ended in making me a wife. Ah, in those days we never dreamed that he or I or any of us would be known in the world. All he seemed then was a boy full of fun, full of love, full of enthusiasm for protecting abused and righting wronged people, which made him in those early days write editorials and wear arms and swear himself a special policeman to protect the poor Negroes in Cincinnati, where we then lived, where then were mobs instigated by the slaveholders of Kentucky. Then he married and lived a missionary life in the New West, all with a joyousness, an enthusiasm, a chivalry which made life bright and vigorous to us both. Then in time he was called to Brooklyn, just as the crisis of the great anti-slavery battle came on, and the fugitive slave law was passed. I was then in Maine, and I well remember one snowy night his writing till midnight to see me, and then our talking till near morning what we could do to make headway against the horrid cruelties that were being practiced against the defenseless blacks. My husband was then away lecturing, and my heart was burning itself out in indignation and anguish. Henry told me then that he meant to fight that battle in New York, that he would have a church that would stand by him to resist the tyrannic dictation of Southern slaveholders. I said, I too have begun to do something. I have begun a story, trying to set forth the sufferings and wrongs of the slaves. That's right, Hattie, said he. Finish it, and I will scatter it thick as leaves of Vallombrosa. And so came Uncle Tom, and Plymouth Church became a stronghold where the slave always found refuge and a strong helper. One morning my brother found sitting on his doorstep poor old Paul Edmondson, weeping. His 2 daughters, of 16 and 18, had passed into the slave warehouse of Bruin and Hill and were to be sold. My brother took the man by the hand to a public meeting, told his story for him, and in an hour raised the $2,000 to redeem his children. Over and over again afterwards, slaves were redeemed at Plymouth Church, and Henry and Plymouth Church became words of hatred and fear through half the Union. From that time until we talked together about the fugitive slave law, there was not a pause or stop in the battle till we had been through the war and slavery had been wiped out in blood. Through all he has been pouring himself out, wrestling, burning, laboring everywhere, making stump speeches when elections turned on the slave question, and ever maintaining that the cause of Christ was the cause of the slave. And when all was over, it was he and Lord Garrison who were sent by government once more to raise our national flag on Fort Sumter. You must see that a man does not so energize without making many enemies. Half of our Union has been defeated, a property of millions annihilated by emancipation, a proud and powerful slave aristocracy reduced to beggary, and there are those who never saw our faces that to this hour hate him and me. Then he has been a progressive in theology. He has been a student of Huxley and Spencer and Darwin, enough to alarm the old school, and yet remained so ardent a supernaturalist as equally to repel the radical destructionists in religion. He and I are Christ worshippers, adoring him as the image of the invisible God and all that comes from believing this. Then he has been a reformer, an advocate of universal suffrage and women's rights, yet not radical enough to please that reform party who stand where the socialists of France do and are for tearing up all creation generally. Lastly, he has had the misfortune of a popularity which is perfectly phenomenal. I cannot give you any idea of the love, worship, idolatry with which he has been overwhelmed. He has something magnetic about him that makes everybody crave his society, that makes men follow and worship him. I remember being at his house one evening in the time of early flowers, and in that one evening came a box of flowers from Maine, another from New Jersey, another from Connecticut, all from people with whom he had no personal acquaintance, who had read something of his and wanted to send him some token. I said, "One would think you were a prima donna. What does make people go on so about you?" My brother is hopelessly generous and confiding. His inability to believe evil is something incredible, and so has come all this suffering. You said you hoped I should be at rest when the first investigating committee and Plymouth Church cleared my brother almost by acclamation. Not so. The enemy have so committed themselves that either they or he must die, and there has followed 2 years of the most dreadful struggle. First, a legal trial of 6 months, the expenses of which on his side were $118,000, and in which he and his brave wife sat side by side in the courtroom and heard all that these plotters, who had been weaving their webs for 3 years, could bring. The foreman of the jury was offered a bribe of $10,000 to decide against my brother. He sent the letter containing the proposition to the judge. But with all their plotting, 3/4 of the jury decided against them, and their case was lost. This was accepted as a triumph by my brother's friends. A large number of the most influential clergy of all denominations so expressed themselves in a public letter, and it was hoped the thing was so far over that it might be lived down and overgrown with better things. But the enemy, intriguing secretly with all those parties in the community who wish to put down a public and too successful man, have been struggling to bring the thing up again for an ecclesiastical trial. The cry has been raised in various religious papers that Plymouth Church was in complicity with crime, that they were so captivated with eloquence and genius that they refused to make competent investigation. The 6 months' legal investigation was insufficient. A new trial was needed. Plymouth Church immediately called a council of ministers and laymen, in number representing 37,000 congregational Christians, to whom Plymouth Church surrendered her records, her conduct, all the facts of the case, and this great council unanimously supported the Church and ratified her decision, recognizing the fact that in all the investigations hitherto nothing had been proved against my brother. They, at his request and that of Plymouth Church, appointed a committee of 5, to whom within 60 days and 1 should bring any facts that they could prove, or else forever after hold their peace. It is thought now by my brother's friends that this thing must finally reach a close. But you see why I have not written. This has drawn on my life, my heart's blood. He is myself. I know you are the kind of woman to understand me when I say that I felt a blow at him more than at myself. I, who know his purity, honor, delicacy, know that he has been from childhood of an ideal purity, who reverenced his conscience as his king, whose glory was redressing human wrong, who spake no slander, no, nor listened to it. Never have I known a nature of such strength, and such almost childlike innocence. He is of a nature so sweet and perfect that though I have seen him thunderously indignant at moments, I never saw him fretful or irritable. A man who continuously, in every little act of life, is thinking of others. A man that all the children on the street run after, and that every sorrowful, weak, or distressed person looks to as a natural helper. In all this long history there has been no circumstance of his relation to any woman that has not been worthy of himself, pure, delicate, and proper, and I know all sides of it, and certainly should not say this if there was even a misgiving. Thank God there is none, and I can read my New Testament and feel that by all the Beatitudes my brother is blessed. His calmness, serenity, and cheerfulness through all this time have uplifted us all. Where he was, there was no anxiety, no sorrow. My brother's power to console is something peculiar and wonderful. I have seen him at deathbeds and funerals, where it would seem as if hope herself must be dumb, bring down the very peace of heaven, and change despair to trust. He has not had less power in his own adversity. You cannot conceive how he is beloved by those even who never saw him. Old, paralytic, distressed, neglected people, poor seamstresses, black people, who have felt these arrows shot against their benefactor as against themselves. And most touching have been their letters of sympathy. From the first, he has met this in the spirit of Francis de Sales, who met a similar plot. By silence, prayer, and work, and when urged to defend himself, said God would do it in his time. God was the best judge how much reputation he needed to serve him with. In your portrait of Deronda, you speak of him as one of those rare natures in whom a private wrong bred no bitterness. Quote, the sense of injury breeds not the will to inflict injuries, but a hatred of all injury. End quote. And I must say, through all this conflict, my brother has always been in the spirit of him who touched and healed the ear of Malchus when he himself was attacked. His friends and lawyers have sometimes been aroused and sometimes indignant with his habitual caring for others, and his habit of vindicating and extending even to his enemies every scrap and shred of justice that might belong to them. From first to last of this trial, he has never for a day intermitted his regular work. Preaching to crowded houses, preaching even in his short vacations at watering places, carrying on his missions which have regenerated 2 once wretched districts of the city, editing a paper, and in short, giving himself up to work. He cautioned his church not to become absorbed in him and his trials, to prove their devotion by more faithful church work and a wider charity, and never have the Plymouth missions among the poor been so energetic and effective. He said recently, the worst that can befall a man is to stop thinking of God and begin thinking of himself. If trials make us self-absorbed, they hurt us. Well, dear, pardon me for this outpour. I loved you, I love you, and therefore wanted you to know just what I felt. Now, dear, this is over. Don't think you must reply to it or me. I know how much you have to do. Yes, I know all about an aching head and an overtaxed brain. This last work of yours is to be your best, I think, and I hope it will bring you enough to buy an orange grove in Sicily or somewhere else, and so have lovely weather such as we have here. Your ancient admirer, my husband, who usually goes to bed at 8 o'clock, was convicted by me of sitting up after 11 over the last installment of Daniel Deronda, and he is full of it. We think well of Gwendolen, and that she isn't much more than young ladies in general so far. Next year, if I can possibly do it, I will send you some of our oranges. I perfectly long to have you enjoy them. Your ever-loving H.B. Stowe. P.S. I am afraid I shall write you again when I am reading your writings. They are so provokingly suggestive of things one wants to say. H.B.S. In her reply to this letter, Mrs. Lewes says incidentally, quote, Please offer my reverential love to the professor, and tell him I am ruthlessly proud of having kept him out of his bed. I hope that both you and he will continue to be interested in my spiritual children. End quote. After Mr. Lewes' death, Mrs. Lewes writes to Mrs. Stowe. The Priory, 21 North Bank, April 10, 1879. My dear friend, I have been long without sending you any sign, unless you have received a message from me through Mrs. Fields. But my heart has been going out to you and your husband continuously, as among the chief of the many kind beings who have given me their tender fellow-feeling in my last earthly sorrow. When your first letter came with the beautiful gift of your book, footnote, Uncle Tom's Cabin, new edition with introduction, end footnote, I was unable to read any letters, and did not for a long time see what you had sent me. But when I did know, and had read your words of thankfulness at the great good you have seen wrought by your help, I felt glad, for your sake first, and then for the sake of the great nation to which you belong. The hopes of the world are taking refuge westward under the calamitous conditions, moral and physical, in which we of the elder world are getting involved. Thank you for telling me that you have the comfort of seeing your son in a path that satisfies your best wishes for him. I like to think of your having family joys. One of the prettiest photographs of a child that I possess is one of your sending to me. Please offer my reverential, affectionate regards to your husband, and believe me, my dear friend, yours always gratefully, M. L. Lewes. As much as has been said with regard to spiritualism in these pages, the subject has by no means the prominence that it really possessed in the studies and conversations of both Professor and Mrs. Stowe. Professor Stowe's very remarkable psychological development and the exceptional experiences of his early life were sources of conversation of unfailing interest and study to both. Professor Stowe had made an elaborate and valuable collection of the literature on the subject, and was, as Mrs. Stowe writes, over head and ears in diablerie. It is only just to give Mrs. Stowe's views on this perplexing theme more at length, and as the mature reflection of many years has caused them to take form. In reference to professional mediums and spirits that peep, rap, and mutter, she writes, quote, each friend takes away a portion of ourselves. There was some part of our being related to him as no other, and we had things to say to him which no other would understand and appreciate. A portion of our thoughts has become useless and burdensome, and again, with involuntary yearning, we turn to the stone at the door of the sepulchre. We lean against the cold, silent marble, but there is no answer, no voice, neither any that regardeth. There are those who would have us think that in our day this doom is reversed, that there are those who have the power to restore to us the communion with our lost ones. How many a heart, wrung and tortured with the anguish of this fearful silence, has throbbed with strange, vague hopes at the suggestion! When we hear sometimes of persons of the strongest and clearest minds becoming credulous votaries of certain spiritualist circles, let us not wonder. If we inquire, we shall almost always find that the belief has followed some stroke of death. It is only an indication of the desperation of that heart hunger which in part it appeases. Ah, were it true! Were it indeed so that the wall between the spiritual and material is growing thin, and a new dispensation germinating, in which communion with the departed blessed shall be among the privileges and possibilities of this our mortal state! Ah, were it so that when we go forth weeping in the grey dawn, bearing spices and odors which we long to pour forth for the beloved dead, we should indeed find the stone rolled away, and an angel sitting on it! But no such angel have we seen, no such sublime, unquestionable, glorious manifestation. And when we look at what is offered to us, ah, who that had a friend in heaven could wish them to return in such wise as this? The very instinct of a sacred sorrow seems to forbid that our beautiful, our glorified ones should stoop lower than even to the medium of their cast-off bodies, to juggle and rap and squeak, and perform mountebank tricks with tables and chairs, to recite over in weary sameness harmless truisms, which we were wise enough to say for ourselves, to trifle and banter and jest, or to lead us through endless moonshiny mazes. Sadly and soberly we say that if this be communion with the dead, we had rather be without it. We want something a little in advance of our present life, and not below it. We have read with some attention weary pages of spiritual communication purporting to come from Bacon, Swedenborg, and others, and long accounts from divers spirits of things seen in the spirit land, and we can conceive of no more appalling prospect than to have them true. If the future life is so weary, stale, flat, and unprofitable as we might infer from these readings, one would have reason to deplore an immortality from which no suicide could give an outlet. To be condemned to such eternal prosing would be worse than annihilation. Is there, then, no satisfaction from this craving of the soul? There is one who says, I am he that liveth and was dead, and behold, I am alive for evermore, and I have the keys of hell and of death. And this same being said once before, He that loveth me shall be loved of my Father, and I will love him and will manifest myself unto him. This is a promise direct and personal, not confined to the first apostles, but stated in the most general way, as attainable by any one who loves and does the will of Jesus. It seems given to us as some comfort for the unavoidable, heart-breaking separations of death that there should be, in that dread unknown, one all-powerful friend with whom it is possible to commune, and from whose spirit there may come a response to us. Our elder brother, the partaker of our nature, is not only in the spirit land, but is all-powerful there. It is he that shutteth, and no man openeth, and openeth, and no man shutteth. He whom we have seen in the flesh, weeping over the grave of Lazarus, is he who hath the keys of hell and of death. If we cannot commune with our friends, we can at least commune with him to whom they are present, who is intimately with them as with us. He is the true bond of union between the spirit world and our souls, and one blessed hour of prayer, when we draw near to him and feel the breadth and length and depth and height of that love of his that passeth knowledge, is better than all those incoherent, vain, dreamy glimpses with which longing hearts are cheated. They who have disbelieved all spiritual truth, who have been Sadduceic doubters of either angel or spirit, may find in modern spiritualism a great advance. But can one who has ever really had communion with Christ, who has said with John, Truly our fellowship is with the Father and the Son, can such an one be satisfied with what is found in the modern circle? For Christians who have strayed into these enclosures, we cannot but recommend the homely but apt quotation of old John Newton. What think ye of Christ is the test, to try both your word and your scheme. In all these so-called revelations, have there come any echoes of the new song which no man save the redeemed from earth could learn? Any unfoldings of that love that passeth knowledge? Anything, in short, such as spirits might utter, to whom was unveiled that which eye hath not seen, nor ear heard, neither hath entered the heart of man to conceive? We must confess that all those spirits that yet have spoken appear to be living in quite another sphere from John or Paul. Let us, then, who long for communion with spirits, seek nearness to him who has promised to speak and commune, leaving forever this word to his church. I will not leave you comfortless. I will come to you. End of chapter 20. Read for you by Michelle Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana.